Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! What does Uzbekistan's first novel, Bygone Days by Abdulla Qodiriy, published in 1926, have to do with the fight for intellectual property rights a century later? A lot. Its translator from Uzbek original into English, Mark Reese, has just won a court case against Uzbekistan's educational institutions which had mishandled his intellectual property rights by uploading Bygone Days onto several university servers across Uzbekistan. Reese, who received the Order of Dustlik from President Shavkat Mirziyoyev in 2019 in recognition of his work promoting the Uzbek language, literature and culture, decided not to let it go. He took the case to court and won. But, in his view, has justice truly been served? This week, Mark Reese is our guest and we'll talk about the cultural and social significance of Otkan Kunlar, so Bygone Days, the message it conveyed about the past, present and future of the region, and the lessons we can draw from it today. We also discuss his early days as a Peace Corps volunteer in Uzbekistan, his love for Uzbek language and literature, what he thinks about Mirziyoyev's reforms, and why he decided to fight for his rights in court. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hey Mark, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Well, thank you for having me.
What is so special about Bygone Days, a very important Uzbek book that you translated from Uzbek into English? Is it true that it was the first novel written in the Uzbek language?
Yes, it's the first full-length Uzbek novel written into English. I put Uzbek into quotes because really the Jadids were transitioning into a standardized idiom at that period of Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Kazakh. They were very much formulating what those meant and defining the languages at the time. And so Qodiriy, he says at the very beginning, experiment with this new idea of a novel and forming national identity around the novel. Very similar to what Daniel Defoe did with Robinson Crusoe and how do you define the English people. Qodiriy was trying to do that with Bygone Days. I think that probably for me, my opinion on it shifts all the time about why it's such an important novel. I think that it sort of answers a lot of the questions about Central Asia that people have had since independence. And you always get these vaguely defined parameters, in Washington, D.C. or in London about, what the stands are, the former Soviet Union, what these places are. And they're always very cumbersome. They never really quite match my experience in the field. And so Otkan Kunlar to me just sort of defines the region and it gives a jumping off point in order to understand who are the Uzbek people, who are the Kyrgyz people, the Kazakhs, who are these people in Central Asia and how to define them in a way that isn't a policy type of formula from Washington, D.C.
Let's explain to our listeners what this book is about and when it was written, because I think that the historical period in which it was created is also quite important.
So the period that it was written was in the 1920s, when many of these nationalities post-Russian Revolution and not long after the end of the Russian Civil War were attempting to define themselves. And we use the term Jadids, Muslim reformers in Central Asia. We could sort of make a parallel comparison to them as the Young Turks in Turkey. But it was kind of a phenomena that was very common after World War I around the world. World War I saw the end of the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. And so people were trying to define themselves along national lines. So it was written in 1926. about 2 years after the delineation of borders in Central Asia, which meant the Uzbek SSR, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, these borders were being formed, these artificial borders that we like to talk a lot about. And there's a lot of debate about the Jadids and how much they were participating in the Soviet experience, how much they believed or didn't believe in that. But they were really the earliest group of reformers. The novel itself is set in 1845, begins in 1845 in Turkestan, which is a generation before the Soviet period. Qodiriy likes to talk a lot about how the book is sort of formulated on stories that were told to him by his grandfather. 1845 is 20 years before the Russian conquest of Tashkent. So I like to define it as a book about memory and loss, about a world that, as Qodiriy's world was becoming homogenized with the delineation of borders in the Soviet experience and sort of the bitterness that came from that. So it's a loss of identity of a world where Turkic people, Persianate people, Jews, Muslims, Christians interacted with each other freely. I don't want to call it a conflict-free interaction, but there's sort of this ecumenical world of influences that he felt were being lost during the Soviet period. So it's a book about memory and loss, but it's also, I think, it's a book about the past to describe his present situation in the 20s and as a warning to the future. So one of the unique aspects of the novel is that Qodiriy speaks directly to the reader. He breaks that barrier and he sort of gives people a warning, that this conflict period of 1845 between ethnic people within the Turkic world, within Central Asia, led to the conquest of Turkestan by the Russians. That internal fighting made it easier for the Russians to take control of Central Asia. It's a love story set in the Turkic-Persian mold between Uzbek and Kamush. Uzbek is the hero of the story. And we sort of watch this journey of Uzbek, which is kind of this autobiography of Qodiriy, the author, as he travels through this world of conflict and corruption and attempting to define what it means to be married, challenging traditional conventions. And so it gets back to the original question of, why translate it? And to me, it answered all these questions about what I was seeing in Uzbekistan starting in 1994 with the Peace Corps. I was part of the second group to go. And, at the end of the experience, I had more questions than I had answers about who were the Uzbeks. What in the hell did I just see in Kokand for a year and a half? What is it about these people? And I think literature has a way of showing things versus telling things in a policy paper or in nonfiction. And Uzbekistan very much changed my life. I'm a kid from the west side of Phoenix, not at all from a privileged background. And Peace Corps was my great opportunity to get out into the world and redefine myself. And I ended up in Uzbekistan. And now I'm 57 last month, 30 plus years of doing it. And, it's been hell of an adventure. So part of translating the novel is just kind of a love letter to the brawl that is Central Asia and trying to come to grips with what it is I had experienced.
We will return to your personal relationship with Central Asia, but let's go back to Qodiriy for a minute. Who was he as a person, as a personality, and how important he is for Uzbekistan and the Uzbek culture?
Great question that I really battle with a lot. Some people don't like me to say this, but we don't know a lot. He was murdered in 1938 by Stalin. His entire generation of intellectuals was killed during the purge. And so we have sort of apocryphal information about him. Really important to me, I had this debate online about cultural appropriation and me, stealing culture or whatever. Did I get permission from the Qodiriy family? The answer is yes. I'm good friends with Pandemir Qodiriy, the grandson, and I work with the granddaughter, the great-granddaughter of Abdulla Qodiriy. These people are old friends since 2012. And so for me, part of, if you don't have documentation, the archives on the Jadids are closed. I don't think they'll ever be open, because once you open them, you find out who dimed out who during the purge, who betrayed who. These heroes, once you put them up to the real light, they're not heroes anymore in 1938. So these archives are really sensitive things. So we don't have any archival information really. But what I do have is apocryphal information from Abdulla Qodiriy, whose father, Abdulla Qodiriy, was also in a gulag for a certain period of time during the Soviet period and came back with stories about his father. And respectfully to the Qodiriy family, it's kind of this injured family. It's a hard tale. Their grandfather, Abdulla Qodiri's grandfather, was murdered in 1938. His father went to a gulag for a significant period of his childhood. They had a hard time growing up. So to me, one of the big things about Bygone Days is just to take that apocryphal information from Abdulla and make sure that it gets represented. And I used to joke that when you translate something into another language and you spread it out into the world, the KGB loses. What do we know about Abdulla Qodiriy? He came from a family of gardeners. They had a significant amount of land. So the Jadids often grew up speaking Russian. They knew their national language, but Abdullah won a gold medal in his youth for speaking Russian. They understood as traders. The Jadids gained a lot of their patronage from people from the bazaar, businessmen, traders. And traders in Central Asia understood like the Greeks in the Mediterranean, understood the importance of understanding other languages in order to do commerce. So Qodiriy studied for a year to be a journalist in Moscow. Chopin, his counterpart, almost all of them went to Moscow at some point and were quite proficient in the Russian language. So they were multilingual people. We could call them bohemians or cosmopolitan to a degree. Like when you go to Istanbul and you see this sort of 1920s, 1930s modernist Turks wearing suits and ties and trying to wrestle with modernity, I kind of consider them the Central Asian version of that. But Bygone Days is the first novel. I mean, I think he had at least 3 print runs and did quite well economically. So my joke is, as we talk about the creative economy in Uzbekistan, the Jadids were the progenitors of a creative economy, which is one of the reasons why they were murdered in 1938. But how he was as an individual, it's hard. I don't know if we have a journal that he ever wrote. I think that a lot of his personal reflections, if I remember correctly from the family, were burned. They were destroyed. So we need to understand and acknowledge that part of what we're doing is when we're reconstructing the identity of the Jadids, it's telling us more about us than it is about the Jadids.
How did your journey with the Jadids and also with translating Uzbek literature start? You mentioned already the Peace Corps that brought you to the region. So explain to us how it all started, because not every single Peace Corps volunteer ends up translating Uzbek literature, right?
No. I mean, I knew Peace Corps volunteers that went to 2 years and never spoke one word of Uzbek or Russian by the time they finished, because there was such a premium on learning English. You had to actually really work to learn the language because everyone wanted to speak English with you. And, I'm a kid. I grew up in Arizona, studied Spanish. Spanish was a reality where I grew up. It was the second language of the region. Whether we're willing to acknowledge that or not is a different question. And I was just this punk rock high school kid that wanted to get out. I grew up with a grandfather that talked to me about adventures traveling during and after World War II and German-American background. And so he spoke some German. So there's always this premium on learning another language. And so when I joined Peace Corps, I thought I was going to go to Guatemala. And then I thought they were going to send me to Africa. And then when I got my invite, it said Peace Corps Uzbekistan. And I had absolutely no idea where it was. In 1993, there were barely any maps of the region other than the former Soviet Union. There was one dictionary that I could order, I showed up in Uzbekistan. It was terrible. None of the words were accurate. And so some of the things that I learned growing up, I think it's a character issue. I kind of grew up in northern Arizona among the cowboy intelligentsia. You learn other people's languages. You make an effort to speak their language and respect them for who they are. I got to Tashkent and then Samarkand, and I said, well, these people grow cotton. I grew up in cotton fields in Arizona. They're largely agricultural. They may be a little bit rough spoken sometimes, but once you make a friend with an Uzbek, you're a friend for life. There's a level of genuineness and interaction that I recognized in Arizona. You say what you mean what you say. So I ended up in Kokand for a year and a half. I was in Termez before that. They moved me out because of safety issues. And then Kokand, really gave me the one word that I really love, probably more than any word in the language, is adab, which is sort of this literary word. It's the base word for adabiyat, which is literature. It comes from the Arabic, which means sort of politeness, being polite, being cultured. And Kokand is very much of a place of literary Uzbek and a literary tradition and just this crazy Turkic language. How cool is that? People would say, you need to learn Russian because that's how you're going to make a living, Mark. Nobody wants to hire an Uzbek speaker. And I said, no, getting to know Uzbeks in Kokand, this is the first chance historically that they get to use the language that the Jadids wanted to create. And it was disrespectful to me, especially in the Fergana Valley, to try to speak Russian to Uzbeks. And I'm this blue-eyed guy, the people in Fergana Valley had never met an American. Like, we were the first two Americans ever in the city of Kokand. So old men would come up to me and they would try to speak Russian with me. And I would say, I know a little bit of Uzbek. And that would flip them out. And they would be really, really quite emotional about it. I think I've got this personality defect that once I follow something, I will chase it down. I am not the smartest person in the room, but I am absolutely the most persistent. So I saw in Peace Corps how passionate people were about their national literature and language. And so I did what every Peace Corps volunteer does, is go to graduate school. And I managed to get into the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Washington. And I really wanted to learn the language at a literary level because in graduate school, I wanted to learn Spanish at the literary level. My mentors in Arizona said, everyone can ask, ¿Dónde está el baño? And everyone can ask where the toilet is, but can you read Marquez in the original? And so I was very lucky with my mentors. And so that to me was, I need to learn Uzbek at the literary level in order to understand what it was I just saw in Kokand.
I've got one more question about learning Uzbek because I tried. I tried when I lived in Uzbekistan, but I found it incredibly difficult because there were no books, and I'm talking about the year 2019, not like you in the 90s. And also there was no methodology. And I really struggled with my teacher, who literally just asked me, what do you want to say in Uzbek? And that was her methodology. And I just, at some point, I just dropped out because I decided that I really can't, or maybe I was already in the age when I didn't feel like I'm open to learning this way. So what was your experience with learning Uzbek? I mean, were you just young and persistent and passionate? Or maybe you had good teachers? How did it work in your case?
So, honestly, in Peace Corps, I had a huge vocabulary. By the time I was done in 2 years, I got into the University of Washington with Ilse Sertautis, an old German with questionable background that goes back to World War II. I was just talking about that last night with my wife about the founder of this department at UW was a Nazi who was relocated after World War II through Operation Paperclip, a guy named Nicholas Papa. So to answer your question, I was really lucky. I had an old school German academic who believed in learning grammar and a deep dive, starting with the Orhan inscriptions in Mongolia and making their way up to a modern idiom. So we all started, whether Kyrgyz, Kazakh, Azeri, whatever, we started with the Orhan inscriptions in Mongolia and learning Turkic runic script. And we made our way up to finally the last year and a half of a generally 3-year program. You pick a modern language, and I chose Uzbek and Uyghur. So she's the one that really gave me grammar. This is a NELC program where you learn an advanced and intermediate local language, and then you learn a Western research language. You'd have nervous breakdowns with this lady. But she taught us grammar. It's like, Mark, you need to learn the grammar. That's what you do at the academy. And then you go out into the field and you practice it over and over and over again. I think your question, though, speaks to where we're in 2026 and Uzbekistan has not gotten it together. when it comes to teaching their own language or their own national identity. I'm pretty cynical at this point. I started out learning Uzbek and Cyrillic, but they've changed alphabets and you're constantly being corrected like, well, this is the proper way to spell this now. And excuse the language, I'm just like, I don't give a shit. When you guys figure it out, tell the next generation. But I'm going to read in Cyrillic. And you guys can clown around with the alphabet, which inevitably, in my opinion, gets to money, funding from the state to come out with these ridiculous, multi-volume dictionaries that were done through Google Translate. And now they're on the AI thing. And now that they're on the AI thing with language, I don't think they're ever going to get it together with the standardized language, nor a methodology on how to teach foreigners.
You started your journey with Uzbekistan during the Islam Karimov times, obviously. And I wonder, what was the difference in working on literature, translating Uzbek literature back then and today, when theoretically Uzbekistan is a different place, much more open to foreigners and much more open to the world?
The Karimov period was dangerous. The first and second Peace Corps groups had the highest assault rate than any Peace Corps country in the world at the time. And here you show up in a village as an American in a pair of boots that's worth 3 months' salary. So Termez was just this, it's a lovely city. I've got nothing against Termez. But back then, a third of the world's heroin went through Termez. And I was fortunate that I grew up in a rough neighborhood and I could take care of myself. But Peace Corps Uzbekistan was the first time I had known real fear in a foreign country. So on one side with Karimov, I'm on this fence. There's the real politique of, you had a war in Chechnya, you had a civil war in Afghanistan, you had a civil war in Tajikistan. You did have moments of violence during the Karimov period, but he kind of managed to hold it together, whether that was intentional or he just got lucky. But on the other hand, I've had people I care a great deal about tortured and murdered in Uzbekistan. And the literary production at the time was also dangerous. I see people, academics like me, who were at one point blacklisted, that are now allowed to return back to Uzbekistan and do their work. Whereas before, for example, the Jadids were not all that popular during the Karimov period. Timur, if you didn't do Amir Timur, you were not kissing the right butt at the time. But back then, still today, unfortunately, if whoever is hosting you, they're basically using you to capitalize on you. And that includes your work. So I knew that when I started working on Ukan Kunlar, doing the research, really, and reading the book in 2002.
So Bygone Days, right?
Bygone Days. Yes. Sorry, Bygone. I knew that if they ever got my notes, my work was gone. It would be stolen. And what that means is that it's being blackmailed by the guy who's hosting my visa, who hadn't paid his employees for 6 months, and basically trying to get out of his grasp and being taken in by some people who really cared about my work. You really had to navigate back then who was hosting you, what their intentions were. There was really next to no professional standards that you would recognize at any university.
What year are you talking about?
Definitely the 90s. By the time I got back in 2002, nothing had really changed. Foreigners were exploited. And it was not a collaboration in the sense that both sides benefit. It was a collaboration in the sense of, I'm going to get you a visa, and if you don't do what I'm going to tell you to do, I'm going to deport you and put you on a blacklist, accuse you of being a spy because you're a foreigner. And then when I went on to work in the military base, it's like, he must be a spy, right? So this obsession with being spied upon really equated to being denied a visa and being kicked out of the country, which is something I know you're familiar with.
Yeah.
I've gone through this, the whole thing. I've gone through the same experience, but especially after K2 and everything. And so now I'm allowed back in the country. I still think that corruption is endemic. You've got people who are for Mirziyoyev's reforms. I do think that he's serious about them. I think that there's a realization that the Karimov period could not continue within the new regime, or you were going to have political violence. And I think that they're serious about that in terms of survival. But on the other hand, you've got a group of people that I don't think at all are interested in reform. Reform means it's going to challenge the status quo, which means it's going to challenge revenue streams with corruption. And you got to be able to stick up for yourself in Tashkent because no one's going to do it for you. But the moment you stick up for yourself, you're the enemy. And how does that equate to the people that I care for in Tashkent?
I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm still banned. I don't know if I'll be able to come back, but I really hope that, someone will think properly. Engaging with someone like me who is actually promoting the region can only benefit a country like Uzbekistan.
It says more about the country than it does about you.
Yeah.
I worked in Washington, D.C. at some high level. I worked for the Department of Defense at one point. Nobody gave a shit about Central Asia. And people barely give a shit about it now. No one's going to put the assets to spy on some local university. But this talks more about the former Soviet Union, and it tells more about the society than it does about the people being accused of it. And, Qodiriy criticized it. Bygone Days, Bygone Days, he criticized corruption. All the issues that we're dealing with today are very prevalent in the book. Corruption, what does it mean to be married? How do you define a marriage? What are the role of women in Islam? What's the role of Islam within the state? So we're living out Qodiriy's dilemma right now. And one of them is that if the foreigner doesn't say what it is you want them to say, they immediately become this enemy. And there's always the foreign devil on the Silk Road type of trope that's pulled out. My debate with those people that believe that is that if you can't handle criticism, it means that you don't have the ability to respond.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. Let's go back to Bygone Days. When did you decide that you want to translate it and how it all started?
I mean, really, some of it's just practical. I was in grad school. I wanted to go back to Uzbekistan. And my professor, Sertauda, said, if you can translate the first 3 chapters of this novel, you know the Uzbek language. And so I had to do it as part of my graduate studies requirements to finish up my degree. But 9/11 occurred. All of a sudden, Uzbekistan became the center of the global stage as a point to invade Afghanistan. And the moment the Twin Towers went down, I knew it had something to do with the Taliban. I knew it had something to do with Central Asia. So I wanted to enlist, and then my graduate committee said, Mark, if you leave now, you're never going to come back. Why don't you go to Tashkent for a year, work on your Uzbek, translate the first 3 chapters of Bygone Days, and then come back and then decide what it is you want to do. So I went to Tashkent, started on the first 3 chapters, and in the Karimov period, nobody wanted to say anything political at all. Nothing religious, make no stance on nothing, or your life is over. So what I noticed is people are asking me, comrade spy, what are you doing here in Tashkent after 9/11? I'm translating Bygone Days. And that was a moment when I started to see people become emotional, like get outside the script of volunteering no information. And I found like I could talk about issues without having to talk about issues. I could talk about Islam. I could talk about the role of women in Islam. Everyone had an opinion about Uzbek and Kamush and Zainab. Man plans, God laughs. I got a job as a translator at K2. I was at K2 when Andijan occurred and got kicked out of the country. I went to Afghanistan for 2.5 years. So during that whole time in Afghanistan, that's when I decided, war is depicted as long moments of boredom spiked with moments of fear. And so I had these long periods of boredom, and I could sit down with a dictionary, grind out this book. And as I started to get deeper and deeper into the book in Tashkent and then Afghanistan, I became more and more fascinated with the story. And I thought to myself, man, this is a great novel. This answers the questions for me. We have whole departments that the U.S. government created after 9/11 that if they had read Bygone Days, a lot of these questions could have been answered for them. I mean, imagine USAID and Department of State and talking about women in Islam and all the problems that we had, in Afghanistan building these programs. Imagine them having a novel that they could read that would start things out for them, like a base jumping off point before talking about all of this abstract theory. And so to me, really getting into it, why I wanted to finish it, well, really, it took me so long to do it because one, I'd been PNG'd from the country, so I couldn't collaborate with anyone. The only people I could collaborate with were in the US. And so I worked with Umida Hikmatullaeva on volume 1, Umida Hashimova on volumes 2 and 3. The numerous mistakes that I made, please catch them. And so I get sucked into this thing and I look up one day and it's 2017. I'm at the Naval Academy. I'm in a leadership position. That's coming to an end. And we lost our first son. And this tragedy hit me and I didn't really want to be part of DOD anymore. Definitely not under Trump. And what am I going to do? So I looked at my wife and I said, I really want to finish this book. I've got rough drafts that I've been going over for years, but I really want to grind this thing out and get it done. So when President Karimov died, I started to hear about this new leader. It was Hamid Ismailov that arranged this interview with BBC about Bygone Days. And I'd sent him some chapters for him to read. He didn't hate it. And I'm going through these end notes and finishing this thing. And then the BBC interview occurred. And I got an invite to go to the embassy by Ambassador Vahabov. And I didn't want to go at all. I mean, I've got some baggage from the Karimov period. I got some hurt feelings. And I'm thinking, I'm going to get some guy with a mustache and a comb over and a grave suit, some asshole in the embassy that I don't want to deal with. And, I show up at the embassy and I meet these friends that I've now been friends for years now, the Zakirov family. And the embassy's full of these young people, like who had gone to Harvard and Georgetown, and they're thriving in the United States. And there's an excitement that this is a new generation, that all of these exchange programs that we had done over the years in Tashkent, they were paying off. These kids that went to study through American councils and studying universities, this is that generation that are now in their 30s and 40s, and they're going to make it happen. And so Vahabov comes in, he's this young guy, comb over, bald head, no mustache, well-spoken, and he just sort of reflected that energy that something was new. You could call the embassy and somebody would pick up the phone, which was a big thing. Back in the Karimov period, you could practically pound on the door and no one would answer it for you. And so I became excited about reform. I think that this is something we don't talk a lot about, is how do you give your average Uzbek youth a sense of pride that we don't have to explain ourselves to the Russians, nothing to the Chinese, nothing to the Americans or the Europeans. They need to be understood within the context of their own language, of their own literature, history, and culture. Give a man a sense of pride in who he is. He doesn't want to leave his mahalla. And I think literature has a way of doing that and getting the book into English and show these people care. We're going to understand you. We're going to meet you at who you are. So that's why I'm all in on President Mirziyoyev's reforms, because what are the alternatives? And so at least he's having the dialogue about corruption. But it's probably not a conversation about his lifetime. It's about the next person who takes control of the country and getting this into the minds of youth, that we're going to have conversations about women in Islam. We're going to have conversations openly about Islam. You can pray namaz in Uzbekistan, in Turkestan, and not have to go to jail for it. So for me, these reforms are real. But again, man plans, God laughs. Mirziyoyev, who's part of that system that built him, has to deconstruct it. I think you got to be part of that system and know where the skeletons lie in order to deconstruct it. At least reimagine it in his lifetime. I think that's the key word. Reimagining a different possibility for Uzbekistan has been the big achievement so far.
Your efforts have been appreciated, and in 2019, you received the Order of Friendship from the president, right? So it's a really great achievement. While you received this prize, you decided to donate the translations of Bygone Days to local universities and institutions in Uzbekistan. What happened later? And what happened that you decided to go to court?
It was real simple. I got an invite after Duslik to go to Tashkent and to meet with local institutions and ministries and people. And I made it very clear to Ambassador Vahabov in some PowerPoint presentations that I had business proposals, that we need to develop a creative economy in Tashkent. This cannot be the Soviet experience anymore. And if we're going to depend on the writers' union, like over the previous 19-something years, we're not going to spread awareness of Uzbekistan at all across the globe. So the MFA invited me. For the most part, it was a great trip. But they just said, can you bring some copies with you? And just to keep in mind, Reese has never been paid for any of this. All the editing costs, all of the things came out of my pocket until Farid Maksudi and Farhad Inangambayev helped me with the final printing costs editing costs that got this thing across the line and made it the beautiful book that it is. But travel, hotels, baggage fees. So, bring 10 books with you. Well, that's $150. Not all Americans can just continue to cough up. We don't print money in our homes in America. We have to work for this. So, okay, this is a big trip. I brought my suit and I brought like 10 to 20 copies of the book to hand out. But I also brought my PowerPoints. And so every single one of these institutions I met with, Ministry of Higher Education, Jahan Tilla, that we're going to talk about in a minute. I brought copies, I a signed copy. I'm not saying don't read the book. Here you go. But if we're going to talk about making it available to students, we need to talk about licenses. We need to talk about printing fees. The Ministry of Higher Education now has a budget of $250 million. Why not I sell licenses to you? I gave them the PowerPoint, but I also gave them the book signed with my name, saying, look, if a student wants to come in here and check it out, I'm not going to deny a student the opportunity to do that. And, since 2017 and 2026, almost 10 years now, I've been sending out proposals to everyone who matters in Uzbekistan, from Saida Mirziyoyev on down. Every single person's gotten a PowerPoint or a proposal. And so they talk about the creative economy, and I wonder, man, you get the order at Duslik, and then, thank you very much. We got our photo op. Thanks for showing up. There's the scandal of the honorarium. I get back from my trip, and I get this guy with a mustache and a comb over saying, on behalf of President Shavkat Mirziyoyev, we know that you incurred some travel expenses. We'd like to give you an honorarium of $10,000, and we would like to buy X number of books from you through Amazon. I'm like, great. I've recovered my costs for the trip. The honorarium didn't show up. The books were never purchased. And it wasn't until I made a stink on Twitter, it was Twitter at the time, about the honorarium that finally somebody got a hold of me and to Western Union me the honorarium, minus $1,000 fee. So later on, why am I doing this? Is because Karimov's essence is still alive in many of these organizations. Locals will contact me privately and say, Mark, we are behind you. Thank you very much for the fight that you're doing right now. Because if I did it, I would lose my job.
So what happened exactly?
I gave them the book. And a year ago, somebody sent me a screenshot from Andajan University, the foreign language, and somebody had scanned the book. And it's now in the Unilibrary system. It's been put up on Telegram. I'm going through the court system, and they finally said it was a presidential decree. The Ministry of Higher Education was following the decree. Jahan Tilla was following the decree, but we're going to blame this one vice rector for scanning the book. They said, we did an investigation. No third-party apps have distributed the book. I'm like, well, Telegram's a third-party app. So we're caught in limbo. I was awarded something like $500 damages. The guy was fined $300, but still the Republic of Uzbekistan doesn't take responsibility for IP theft. The president said, scan the book, digitize it. He didn't say steal it. So I think it's just a typical Uzbek ministerial issue that they have their KPI. They want to say they scanned X number of books a year, and they did it, and they didn't put any thought into intellectual property rights. And it finally took Mark Reese to come forward to say, you know what, I'm going to fight you over this. Because one, I know you're incompetent. Two, I know you're corrupt. And three, I know that the Republic of Uzbekistan is never going to take responsibility for this. And meanwhile, they're coming to my country talking about doing business, saying that we're going to protect American business interests. Like, well, what about me? So it's becoming a problem that the Republic of Uzbekistan takes responsibility for nothing. Mark, thank you for doing everything you do, but you're screwed. And, now we're going to have to appeal the case for me to get compensation, for me to get damages. But what I really want is for the Republic of Uzbekistan to man up and take responsibility for incompetence and corruption. Because I'm telling you, big businesses to invest in Uzbekistan, but IP is the basis of the American identity. It is who we are. IP is the center of a creative economy. I've gotten no apologies from nobody. I show up to court, it's a Karimov-era court. They want to know the identity of the person who gave me the screenshot. And I tell them to go eat shit and die. I'm not going to give the identity of the person because I'm going to ruin that person's life. I've been doing this before they were born. Forget the apology. Just take responsibility for what you did.
But you won the case, right? A couple of days ago, the court decided that you are right. So what else would you like to happen?
This is the typical sophistry. Mark Reese won the case so that they can have their PR moment abroad. But my book was distributed among 1.3 million Uzbek students. It was digitized into a PDF. And now the Ministry of Justice is saying, well, we show no proof that it's been spread out into the world. I'm like, well, prove it. I've seen no proof that you've actually investigated it. Show us the methodology that you can prove that a PDF hasn't been sent to everyone and their cousin across the globe. So the Ministry of Justice says, we show no proof that this has been disseminated among third-party apps. Telegram is a third-party app. Well, it was unintentional. Well, okay, you didn't say steal Mark Reese's book. You're incompetent and you mismanaged IP. You had a system of incompetence that led to me having a financial loss. And by the way, we were going to come up with a student edition to where it was dirt cheap, but we're so caught up in the system now, we don't have time to come out with the student edition. So the court's justifications for why the Republic of Uzbekistan, why the Ministry of Higher Education, why Jahan Tilalade, why they are not responsible for it is just absolutely bizarre. And if they present that same type of logic across the globe, there will be no foreign investment in Uzbekistan. And so it's kind of like you in a way, like they have one of the best ambassadors for Uzbek language, literature, and culture. And I'm pissed off. You walk into an office in Tashkent, you never know if it's 1994 or it's 2026. So the maximum fine for IP theft is $30,000. I have Andajan Foreign Languages. The National University of Uzbekistan was caught uploading it to the server. And Jahan Tilla was caught loading it up to the server. Yet they say that they've removed it from the server. They've shown me no proof of the forensic efforts that they've made to show that this thing's not sitting on some server in Horizm or in Nakus or Almaty or Moscow or Frankfurt. The entire situation has been completely opaque. There's no transparency for a foreigner to even understand what the process is, nor offering the foreigner any proof. So in my opinion, justice has not been done. I've won nothing. What I've seen is incompetence and mishandling of IP information. And this has been going on since 1991. So it's just nothing but sophistry. Mark Reese has won, but we're going to give him $500 in damages after ruining his business in Central Asia, after ruining a market among 1.3 million Uzbek students, tourists, whoever. They can now go to the net. I've already found a copy on Scribe that I've had to have pulled down. So it's already out there. The rectors of these three universities didn't show up to court. Not one ministry person showed up to court. And if they did, it was a spokesperson who showed up later on in the day. I've received no calls from the apparat, no calls from the ambassador in DC. I've written the Mirziyoyev family 2 emails. The last one basically saying, is this okay with the Mirziyoyev family? The maximum fine is $30,000 per individual case. There are what they call moral damages, which is a $250,000 fine. I think I've got some moral damages. And on top of that, there's the cost of time and effort for me to go to court. I'm lucky that Legal Max is doing this pro bono, that they're helping me out. what I'm looking at is just to pursue this, they make it absolutely impossible for me to pursue the case without spending personal money. So the first court fee was $1,350. I was awarded damages for something like less than $1,000. So I'm losing money by going to court. We're going to say you won, but if you want to continue to do this, you're going to have to spend money out of your own pocket. We're prepared to go to the Supreme Court of Uzbekistan until the Republic of Uzbekistan cuts a deal and takes responsibility for this. And if we don't get satisfaction in Uzbekistan, I'm going to take it to the international arena.
I really hope for the best. I hope that the case is going to end up with your victory. Thank you so much, Mark. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm really sorry that this happened to you.
So what I'm hoping is that this affects some sort of change. There's personal satisfaction, but there's also me being able to give a voice to people who are just too simply afraid to speak up. And I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. What are they going to do to me?
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.